Good evening, everybody. Steve Zarinsky, co-chair of Building Code Committee. Happy to have you all here, and in a few minutes I think the rest of the seats will be filled. Tonight's presentation is on foundations and how important they are and what happens when you don't design them right. Larry Keller and his associate from Whitestone is going to talk about that. Just give you an idea of what's happening in the near future. We have a presentation next month on the 10th. Here, it hasn't been posted yet, on the topographical office in Manhattan. Will be here making a presentation on their old maps and how they do house numbers. And it will be, they're pulling out maps that no one's seen before. You know, the waterfront, showing how usually it started and kind of built out and all this. Fascinating. Watercolors from the 1700s. Amazing. Anyway, so I'm going to not talk about that now because that's next month. But I'm going to let Larry talk about foundations. So anyway, give a hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Good evening, everyone. As Steve said, my name's Larry Keller. Glad to be here tonight. And just to give you a little background on Matt and I'm a geotechnical engineer. I'm registered, I think, about 24 states now. You know, and a lot of things we go through apply from Florida to Massachusetts, out in western New York, kind of areas that I get to see it all across probably the eastern half of the country more than anything else. I'm more on the geotech side. Matt's an environmental engineer. He's also a licensed engineer, which you don't see that too often, but he's got some environmental chops, and he'll go through some of this. And as Steve said, he looks at it from a foundation standpoint, and this is really overall due diligence, not just for the foundations, but for the building itself. Matt will talk a little bit about if you have a client that's looking to redevelop an existing building, or things you need to think about of hazardous materials and PCBs, asbestos, and things like that. So hopefully you'll be a little bit more dangerous and be able to advise your client a little bit of things that they should be thinking about, or things you should be thinking about if you need to pull a team together and things like that. So I think we're going to start with environmental, so I wasn't sure, so I'm going to flip to it. These are some of the things that phase 1 environmental site assessment, surveys, and some of the geotech investigation scope, where we're drilling borings and looking at foundations and trying to assess what type of foundations are going to allow your building to stand. And I was right. We are starting with environmental. So we're going to do a quick switch, and we'll switch back. I think I picked up about midway. So Matt, come on up.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us. I've never worked at any site that looks like that. Usually it's not as nice. It doesn't change the text. Okay, I'll look over here. So the first, I'm going to go through basically beginning to end in terms of environmental due diligence. And so the first step in environmental due diligence is usually a phase 1 environmental site assessment, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. If your client needs a commercial loan, they're required to get every bank requires a phase 1 ESA. And the seminal guidance document is the ASTM E1527, which is updated periodically, and it was updated last in 2021. And basically the purpose of a phase 1 is to find or recognize environmental condition, which the definition is the second bullet, but it's basically was there a discharge of hazardous substance in the environment, or could there be a potential discharge to the environment? And so basically what it is, it's a desktop evaluation and a site reconnaissance. We don't do there's no borings, there's no drilling, there's no sampling when we do an ESA. We evaluate the site history, current site conditions, to identify recognized environmental conditions, controlled recognized environmental condition, historical recognized environmental conditions, and business environmental risks. And then we provide recommendations for a phase 2 or any other corrective action or remediation if necessary.
Would that include plumes nearby?
Yeah, so yes, that's a vapor encroachment screening. So if there's a site that's adjacent or nearby to the property and there's potential for groundwater contamination to migrate on the property, which could result in vapor intrusion into the building, yeah, it would include, that's a tier 1 vapor encroachment screen, is typically included in a phase 1 ESA. And feel free to interrupt and interject and ask questions. Just with a group like this, we'll keep it pretty informal. What's highlighted here are the generally the required components of a phase 1. We do a site reconnaissance and review public records, historical documentation, and then we interview the site owners, any tenants. Usually we don't end up getting in touch with the neighbor, but if somebody pops their head in, we'll talk to them. And it all culminates in a phase 1 ESA report, which includes findings and recommendations. So there's other environmental due diligence tasks which we usually will recommend for our clients who are looking to buy a piece of property, and that could be an asbestos-containing material survey, lead-based paint evaluation, a mold assessment, and an indoor air quality evaluation. Wetlands and ecological survey, historical and cultural resources. I don't know too much about it. They're in there. I can hook you up with the right person if you have any questions. So an ACM survey is, it looks for, we're assessing the building for asbestos-containing materials. We recommend it anytime somebody's going to buy a piece of property that has a building on it. And a survey and abatement, if necessary, is required prior to demolition of a building or renovation. So in New York, there's before you get a permit, before you get a building permit or a demo permit, they require an asbestos survey for any building built after 1994.
87.
Yeah, 1990, 94. And so we would do a survey. You do a survey and submit a form called an ACP5. If there's no asbestos, you submit that form and you can get a building permit. Usually these two forms, the ACP5 and the ACP21, which is submitted after, if there was abatement, it's submitted after the abatement. Usually that's where people get tripped up with their construction schedule. People kind of, an estimate, an expediter will forget about it, and they say, oh, did anybody submit the ACP5? And then we had to kind of scramble to get out there and do an ACM survey. So just, be mindful if somebody is gonna purchase and redevelop a building or demolish a building, to get an ACM survey, and make sure that the contractor's proposal includes submitting an ACP5.
Getting those reports, the state has become much more, I'm going to say, finicky about how you take your test, and you can't just test what you want to test. You have to test all the surfaces.
Right.
And otherwise, what happens is they'll come back later and give a violation to the asbestos investigator.
Yeah, if you're renovating a portion of a building, the whole building doesn't need to be clear. Only the portion that you're renovating needs to be clear of asbestos. But yeah, it's an important step. Okay, so abatement, removing the asbestos from the building. The EPA and usually the state requires a 10-day notice before you start abatement. Depending on the size of the area that contains the asbestos materials, you need to provide some kind of containment, whether it's a small room like this, we can tarp off the doors and call that good, or if we're abating a whole building, the whole building is tented. An alternative to abatement is encapsulation, which is, you know, encapsulating like a floor that has 9x9 floor tiles. Usually that ends up being more expensive in the long run because it costs almost costs more money to do the encapsulation the right way. And then if you're gonna redevelop down the road, you're gonna probably wanna remove that ACM anyway. So, yeah, go ahead.
What about roofing for tinting a building or not? Is it?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. There's different kinds of abatement techniques to minimize any particulates. And anytime there's a controlled demolition or abatement, there's air monitoring requirements to ensure that there's no like fugitive emissions off the piece of property. So there's ways of kind of getting around that for roofing or hard to enclose areas. Okay, and then so a requirement post abatement is to get air clearance samples, which just means that the facility is free of any asbestos fibers in the air. Phase 2. Okay, so this is what I do. This is where we take the findings of phase 1 and we actually go and collect samples. You've got a recognized environmental condition. There's potential contamination, and we go and we sample soil or groundwater or soil vapor to see if there actually is those wrecks are contaminated. It's not intended to be a comprehensive delineation or investigation. It's just, do you have a problem? Yes or no. Trying to judge the magnitude from a phase 2 is sometimes difficult, and usually they can be iterative. You know, you do a phase 1 and then a phase 2. We identify contamination. We say, hey, you know, we should look into this one wreck a little bit more. There's, you know, high levels of contamination, or you know, maybe it's a limited area or something like that to sort of quantify what the client would be into for remediation.
Are there different ways of remediation? One would be like removal, another one would be to let it air out, make a pile, and let it
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are 1,000, depending on what kind of contamination you have. There are 1,000 different technologies, and from removing contaminated soil and disposing of it off-site to chemical injections into groundwater to remediate contaminated groundwater. Soil vapor extraction. I've got a couple. I think I have a slide on remediation.
And a lot of times it's a cap and a deed notice or something.
Right.
Along those lines.
That's a good point. Yeah, if you have a site where it's going to be a commercial site and you don't meet the commercial soil cleanup objectives in New York, you can put an impermeable cap on and implement a deed restriction on the property.
Right, which could be your building, the paving.
Right.
Whatever.
Landscaping. If there's a 2 foot of clean fill. All right, so yeah, I covered a lot of this. If we identify any wrecks that may need investigation, we recommend conducting a phase 2, and obviously it's dependent. The scope of the phase 2 is dependent on the findings of the phase 1, and I find that the phase 2 is the most important because it can actually give us an idea how to quantify what kind of cost a developer or a client is going to be potentially incur to deal with their environmental issues when they go to redevelop, or if it's too risky, they may back out of the deal. So I'll go through a couple different remediation technologies here. Yeah. So only a couple pictures, never mind Larry. So this is somebody loading an underground storage tank into a lot of times in the city we find several underground storage tanks from a former gas station or heating oil tanks to heat a building, and we remove them. If your soil is contaminated, the quickest and easiest thing is just to remove it and dispose of it off-site at a regulated facility. Say what? Sorry?
Send it to Jersey.
Send it to Jersey. We've been sending it to PA quite a bit lately, actually. Groundwater remediation. There's many different technologies to remediate contaminated groundwater that are beyond the scope of this conversation. And as we talked about before, just capping the site and implementing a deed notice. And then for groundwater, another thing is natural attenuation. Sometimes contamination just kind of goes away on its own. And then what I do, I specialize actually in vapor mitigation, which I'm sure you guys have seen quite a bit. It's like a radon system beneath the building. It's perforated pipe beneath the slab of the first floor, and PVC ventilation pipes going to the roof. So yeah, that's kind of why I end up talking to architects most, because I'm an engineer, so I like to, if it works, I don't care how it looks, but you guys care how it looks, and if there's 12 4-inch diameter pipes going up the side of the building, you kind of want to have a conversation with me. So no.
So you how do you take the pipe? I mean, it's
Well, how do we bring it to the roof?
Vapor mitigation is done.
Yeah, so there's a layer in the gravel base beneath the first floor of the ground floor of the building. In that gravel bed, there's an array of perforated pipes, and then they terminate at one or more solid pipes that extend up to the roof. And any vapors, any volatile vapors that accumulate, they go up and out. So I usually end up getting on the phone with the architects at that stage to figure out, hey, where can I put these pipes, and where it's aesthetically pleasing, and can I get it in a wall, and it's not often that there's a straight shot for like an 18-story building. Is there a straight shot from the ground to the roof? Is usually requires a couple design iterations.
And sometimes you install these just as a precautionary measure, because to not do it later,
Right.
if you find out later that you have a vapor intrusion issue, it's a much bigger deal when the building and the slab are already there. As it's relatively inexpensive to put plastic pipe below the floor slab if
Right.
you do it on the front end.
I got more slides here. So a PCA is basically documenting. So the phase 1 ESA is the ground, and ACM is asbestos. The PCA is just what does the property look like, the physical condition. So we look at documentation on critical components of a building, like the HVAC system, the windows, the roof, and understand how old those components are. We do an inspection of the property to look at the condition of all those components, and then we'll prepare a cost estimate and an approximate lifespan of those components, and then compile that into a report.
So you want condominium associations that require that now?
So yeah, I am going to get to that. Thanks. When a homeowners or a condo association needs to generate their reserve estimate, they need to know how much am I going to need, are we going to need a new HVAC system in 10 years, and how much is that going to cost, and they use that to develop their reserve. In some states, I don't know if New York does.
They will, not yet.
You don't think so? Yeah, okay. But Florida actually requires ongoing PCAs since that building collapsed a few years ago, and they actually they review the homeowners association reserves and the PCAs. Right, and we identify any deficiencies requiring repair, and come up with a replacement schedule for any componentry. All right.
We made it.
Now we're on the
Very-
geotech.
Yeah, that was good. That was quick. All right. So one thing I'll add to that before we get into more of the geotechnical, I'll bring my water with me, is that the purpose of that phase 1 ESA, the reason the banks want it, is something called all appropriate inquiry. So if you don't do a phase 1 ESA and there's contamination on the property that you buy, it's now your contamination and your problem. If you do the phase 1 ESA, then you could go back to the responsible property, the responsible parties, I should say. So that's an important aspect of that. Oh, that's interesting too. We're changing up here and not changing here. You
Yeah.
alluded to that. Okay, so, and what Steve said in the beginning of this is a little bit of our environmental geotechnical due diligence presentation, and now we'll get into the ground a little bit more. I guess we're moving top down instead of bottom up, and these are some of the things and some of the approaches that we typically use when we have a client that's looking to purchase a property, and some things they need to think about so that they don't get in over their head after they already have the property. Because, look, you can specify stone on the wall that you acquire from halfway around the world. You can get whatever kind of windows you want, but the site is the site, and a lot of times in real estate it's location, 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 and all the good sites are gone. So a lot of times, most of the developments now, before they get started, before you get a building, before you start picking out what you pick out, you know, we usually have to go through these hurdles. So it's you know, an important part of the overall process, right? So what is a geotech investigation? Who's read a geotech report, a geotechnical report? Just show hands. All right, that's good. All right. Sometimes I don't get any, but I'm glad to see that. It's basically a subsurface. It's a physical evaluation. When Matt was talking about his phase 2 ESA, environmental site assessment, he'll also drill in the ground, collect samples, but he'll run chemical tests on it. When you do a geotech investigation, you generally don't do any kind of chemical tests whatsoever from the standpoint of looking for contaminants. And really we're looking for, it's a lot of times from a real estate, from a due diligence standpoint, it's looking for what type of foundations are we going to have? Can we use a conventional ground supported floor slab? For retaining walls, what are the pressures that are going to be on the retaining walls? Or can we put a basement in? Where's groundwater? You know, all important steps. Most of the time you're doing something with either test borings, with a drill rig, test pits, a big excavator, or sometimes geophysical, where you get into, sometimes you get into carbonate rock areas, you get into areas with former mines. If anybody's heard what's going on with Route 80 East in Wharton, New Jersey right now, Route 80 East is closed down. They had a sinkhole open up, and then another one open up 75 feet away, and it's from an old mine. There were a lot of iron mines in that part of Jersey recently. So that was a major highway that was shut down because of it. So when do you need to do a geotech investigation? So if you're going to develop a site, you know, I'm a little biased, but I think you need to do them. If you have a client, a lot of times you'll work with, if you do work with retail clients or commercial clients, they actually have a program in place where they have specifications, they want to see those met. Or there's a lot of local land development ordinances, you know, across the country. Certainly in New York City, it's very well defined. It's probably more defined here than in most other places. So if the building code is going to call out what you need, regional geologic considerations. If you're out in College Point, you know, I don't know if it's regional, but you know you're going to have, you know, I think a lot of sites we've done along 20th Avenue out there, it's all, you know, 27 feet of garbage fill over another 10 feet of organics over weighted hammer material, very soft material for 80 to 100 feet. And if you've ever, has anybody ever been around, walked around, seen some of these parking lots out there where you've got manholes sticking out of the ground? There's what used to be a wall box. I don't know what it is now. But the building was on piles, so the building was going nowhere. But the parking lot wasn't, because you never pile support a parking lot. It's way too expensive. It would be crazy. But since the building didn't move, the parking lot sank. They were just throwing asphalt between the sidewalk, which was also pile supported, to the rest of the parking lot. Well, this thing got so steep that you had people that couldn't hold on to their carts. They were losing carts down this ramp. They had, you know, so the carts were going crazy. They had bird baths everywhere. So, you know, in the middle of summer, no one really noticed it, but in the middle of February, when it just became an ice rink. So those kind of things can become a big deal. And, you know, those issues out in College Point are really tough to deal with, but most of the time the answer is to keep paving. It's really what you end up doing. And the last bullet is whenever you really need to know what's going on, which that's when I say you should almost always do it. But why are we doing it? Why are clients doing it? And really what we're trying to do is manage that risk. Because every site has specific conditions to it, and not just the site itself, but it also depends what your construction is and what are you building. Are you going 2-3 stories below grade, below ground? So now we're worried a little bit more about rock. We're worried a little bit more about groundwater. Was this previously a 3-story residential? Now you want to build a high-rise. Obviously, it's different condition. The borings need to be deeper. You need to understand deeper subsurface conditions. So every raw land site and every previously developed site, they all have site-specific conditions and project requirements that lead you down this path. A lot of times from a development standpoint, you're looking at it just, what are my costs going to be to develop this property? That's really what you're trying to answer. But when you think of it from a design standpoint, some of the things I touched on, but there's cut fill, there's bearing capacity or site layout. Sometimes it helps you from a site layout standpoint where I know I have issues on this side of the site, so I'm going to try and throw my basement on the other side. Or I'm going to try and throw my big cuts and change my grading and so forth based on where my issues are. Dewatering is the big one, right?
Also, one has a habit of assuming that all the ground is the same throughout the whole site.
Yeah.
So you take 3 borings and suddenly you think you have it all figured out, you don't know anything.
Well, yeah, there is a little bit of that, and I do tell that to a lot of younger engineers that we work with, and if you're a civil engineer and there's a setback, or an architect and there's a property line setback and it's in the code, you know what it is. But as geotechnical engineers, to Steve's point, we drill a boring here on this side of the building, we drill another one 100 feet away, and we have to make a model of what's in between. And that takes, there is some judgment that goes into that, there's some experience that goes into that, and it's a real-time evaluation, certainly from the time you make your model through construction. And sometimes that can be frustrating, but that is what it is. You're not going to drill a boring every 5 feet. And even if you did, you can still miss things. It still happens. Certainly in carbon rock sites where the bedrock is pinnacled, and you can drill a boring right here, you'll hit rock at 5 feet, you move over 10 feet, you'll go down 40 feet until you hit rock again. Or existing fill sites where every site, every bucket that you put, or every truck that came to the site that dumped that fill could have been different. I see a green lot in Brooklyn with just full of grass and development all around. I know we're going to pull the craziest stuff out of the ground once we start getting in there. That's one that it was there for a reason that hasn't been developed yet. So what scope is needed? And this is more of a strategy approach to what you need. And a lot of times you have to look at what you're trying to achieve at the end result. I think a lot of times from a due diligence standpoint, it's always good to do things in stages. For instance, you have a client that wants to buy a property. They want to be the first ones there. They want to understand what their issues are, but they don't know if they're going to get the zoning that they want. Right, so you may not go all in and do all the borings that you would normally do. You may do a couple of here and there, answer the big questions. Yeah, you're going to need deep foundations, or no, you're not. You might need just some type of ground improvement, and then you go back. So then you get your zoning, you develop your concept, and you feel good about what the building is, what it's going to look like. Now maybe you go back and you address all the code requirements, and you get each boring for 2,000 square feet or wherever you are and what you need. That's generally a good way to do it. There is some iterative process to that. You end up generating 2 reports. So if you're not 100% on the site that it's going to happen, then that's a good way to do it. If you are and you know it and it's all about time, then yeah, you go straight ahead and plow forward and get as much as you can. And ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to meet code and minimize change orders once you go to construction, because when that model is off, because there was something different between those two boring locations. It can be a time delay. You've got one contractor on the project probably at that time. They're not bidding it. There's no other contractor bidding on what that change is. You're on the clock. You know, time is a factor with all this. The owner wants to get everything done and everything up. They want to get their foundations in so they can get their next loan from the bank or whatever it is. So it's a lot better to have, it's cheap insurance, if you ask me, to get some of this stuff as much as you can up front. So if you are working with a geotech engineer, these are some things that are helpful to bring them in the loop on. It seems crazy, but I have to say site location, because sometimes I'll get a square on a plan. Maybe it's even a tax map with no location of where, I know what municipality it's in, and say, I need a geotech report. And for us, it's tough to do that. I really need to know more what the site development plan is, what your grading is, and what your loading is. Quite frankly, if it's an 18-story building, if it's a 100-story building, I don't care. I just want to know what it loads on the foundation. And sometimes I'll get that too, where we'll get on a team. We did a lot with Richmond University Medical Center, and I remember getting on that team, and they're like, "Well, how much hospital work do you have?" And I'm like, "Well, here's a list of projects we do, but it doesn't matter to us what happens above. Again, that's your world of what the walls look like, what furniture is picked out, or what the sight lines are, much beyond what I know about." And it's wet loads. So the loads are really important, the cuts, what the elevation, what the floor elevations are, how deep you're going. Those are important things to know. Existing condition survey, that's great to have because we need to understand how we're going to access the location. So whenever we have those, it's great. Sometimes when you're adding an existing elevator in the basement of, with 8 foot of overhead clearance, that's something we got to go and see, and we got to figure out how we're going to get a rig into something like that. But we can do that. But if it's an open site, a survey is always great. So here's the typical scope of work is utility clearance. That's a big part of it. There's a public process, but the public process only stops. It stops at public right of way. So if you're ever off of the public right of way, then there is nobody who marks it up. And so if there aren't existing plans, it's always good to have there are private locators that come out, and they'll pick up magnetic, anything they can with a magnet, or if they can see a manhole, if they can see that, they can connect to that and try and trace a line across it. But if you have an old sewer, an old clay pipe or something like that, there's not much everybody can do about that. So it's a little bit of risk we take when we do this. So generally, yeah, so you do the utility clearance, you go out there with some kind of investigation technique. It's important to have a field engineer out there and not just send a driller out, because it's a dynamic process. You don't always know exactly what you're going to find. You want to make sure that you have the rig out there. You want to modify the program. We have a plan going in. Hey, we're going to drill these borings 30 feet deep, and we're going to sample X, Y, and Z. But then we get something strange, and we want to delineate it better. So you want to have an engineer out there with a drill rig doing the monitoring and sample collection. And then we'll take samples back to the lab. We'll run index tests to see gradation. Is it a granular material? Is it fine grained? Is it going to swell when it takes on water? What's the strength of it overall? And that's usually wrapped up in a nice little report that a few of us have looked at here. So that's good. Things to consider. A lot of times too, I get, we're in the middle of, we're called in the middle of due diligence. I get a call, hey, I've got 60 days due diligence. How soon can you get out there and get this done? And generally, well, it depends on what you're doing, but it's 4 to 6 weeks, unless it's you're spending a lot of time in the field is probably what you normally see for this. But that's assuming we can get a rig on site, because I go on site and the owner says, well, I need a certificate of assurance. We need this access agreement. And the owner hasn't even signed an LOI with us on this property yet. So, that tends to drag on. So access, I always like to say. if you're dealing with an owner that is trying to get this work done. From a site disturbance standpoint, it's a drill rig, and we're going to drill a hole in the ground. So if it's new pavement, we'll patch it, but there will be a hole there. If you're drilling and there's clays that come up sometimes, and water and so forth, that can stain concrete a little bit. And it's generally not in most geotech investigations to restore things, to landscape, to clean things up. That's usually an added step. It can be done. It's just you typically don't see that happen. If you're on a contaminated site, what do you do with the drill spoils? It's just like anything else with earthwork. If you dig a hole in the ground, the material that you get out will swell, and you will not get that all back in. And there's always a little bit of extra. So if it's just typical site, non-contaminated, it's okay. Maybe you can spread it in some areas that don't have pavement or other landscape areas. If not, you have to manage it off-site. Sometimes when you take things off-site, you have to test it. The minute you test it from an environmental standpoint, because nobody wants to take soil these days, right? No one wants it. And they want you to test it, you have to show them tests. And the minute you test it, something pops up. It's inevitable. Utility mark-out clearance, we talked about that a little bit. Existing site structures, operations, local ordinances. Yeah, just things to think about. I can think of drilling inside of a warehouse, and we had just a typical combustion engine, spitting out exhaust fumes and things like that. And we didn't know, but on the other side was they did makeup. They did these makeup kits. They made these plastic molds for makeup kits. And the next day or so, I get a call that all the makeup kits smell like exhaust fumes. I'm like, oh my, that was. Luckily, we resolved that. But you have to think about that. If we drilled outside of schools, and when you do go through this drilling process, part of it is what's called a standard penetration test, where you're driving a steel into the ground. You got a 140-pound hammer that falls 30 inches, and you're just doing that over and over again, driving this pipe in the ground. And you can imagine when we have somebody drilling outside the window of a school that's in operation, the teacher's not quite happy with that, and rightly so. If we would all thought about this ahead of time, but you need to think about ongoing operations and things like that. Some local ordinances only want you to be drill at certain times. Maybe you're looking for seasonal high groundwater. You got to do things during the wet season, which is now generally in most places between January and April, and things like that. Field activity scheduling report time. It's usually pretty good, but I'd say industry standard to get a drill rig on a site, it's a couple of weeks for most sites. And depending on, generally the way it goes about 1 to 2 weeks to get the rig mobilized. Depending on what you're doing, you could be drilling for months, you could be drilling for 3 days to get the production done, depending on what the project is. And then after the field work is complete, it's about 1 week to 2 weeks to complete lab testing, then another week to 2 weeks for the report. So a lot of times, and sometimes I stretch that out, sometimes it's 4 to 6 weeks if you're drilling in the field for less than a week, from the time someone says go to the time it's done. All right. Now here are all the pictures that Matt felt like he didn't have enough. Just to show you a typical truck-mounted drill rig, that's on your left. You just drive right up, and then that tower, as it's driving, it lays across the rig, kind of like you see on this ATV, on the yellow one on the left. And then it just flips the tower right up, and you start drilling. That's the nice thing about a truck site, is the truck can drive itself. You have these off-road rigs or ATVs, and this wasn't ours, but this looks like it's driving right through the wetlands. I have to see where we pulled that from. But you have to bring it in on a lowboy or some other kind of truck, so it's a little bit more expensive, but it can go anywhere, go off pavements and all kinds of places. What is this? Oh, okay, this is Atlantic Avenue. This was one of those phased approaches, right? So we went in, we did a bunch of borings. We gave some recommendations for foundations and SOE and things like that. And then as soon as they went to demo, as soon as they got the roof off, we went and got the remaining borings so we can sign off on the TRs and everybody can get the permit in time. So, you know, that's part of that phased approach you can do. You can do borings without a roof on it. There are rigs that, you know, in a room like this that you can do, but the production it takes a lot longer. It's a lot more expensive. What is this one? Oh, this is just a track mounted rig. There's nothing too exciting in that one. I don't remember why that one's there. Oh yeah, here's one of those ones that are inside. This one's neat too. It's probably tough to see for everybody, but this has the hydraulic hoses that we can set everything out on the sidewalk, and you can drill on the inside. And you know, this has a little bit of a lower headroom. That one's got decent headroom, but a normal rig needs about 26 feet or so to raise that tower up. You know, this one looks like it's about, I'd give it 14 feet, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then what we're doing is, when we drill, we're also collecting samples. And what you'll normally see is you'll see it through a split spoon. And then this is the split spoon over here, so you take the shoe off the end and then it falls right over. And this is a little bit of a grainy picture. I wonder if I can, yeah. On the right, when it falls over, you can see the sample. This was a nice sandy sample. You know, we'll collect the sample out of there and we'll put it in some jars. Lid of the jars. This is, you know, just some information that identifies where it is and the depth and how. These are blow counts right here with that 140-pound hammer. How many blows it took to drive it 6 inches, and that's 4 successive 6-inch increments. You're becoming geotechnical engineers here just a little bit. This is developer prepared pad sites. I had this on. We do this one for civil engineers quite a bit too, and they run in this a lot. I would say out parcels for developer prepared pad sites generally are where we see a lot of issues, because a lot of folks focus on the anchor tenants, and those out parcels can be a disaster. Another important thing is part of the investigation process is seasonal high groundwater. An important aspect to this is, and you have to think about it from the groundwater level readings that you get. And what I'll see a lot of times is I'll see someone will go out, they'll drill boring, you know, they'll put a tape down the hole, we'll see where it gets wet, and they'll say, okay, that's where my groundwater is. And that's not realistic. It's like taking a picture right now and saying this is the weather all the time. And you can do a couple of things. You can put a well in the ground. You can monitor it over months. We have automatic water level loggers that'll take a reading every minute, every 20 minutes. But to me, was that a dry year? Right? Was it a dry year? Was it a wet year? If it was a wet year, probably all right. But there are other things called seasonal high groundwater, where you see things like mottling and depletions in the soil that the way the soil changes based on where the high water mark in the ground is. And for basements, things like that, or where you want to know groundwater elevation, to me that's the only real way of doing it with confidence.
How about with tidal action, when you get to within like 20 feet of the shoreline?
Yeah, same thing. That's even more so you'd want to do that, right? Because, and it depends. Look, I've seen groundwater fluctuations of 7 feet. It doesn't, you think it should only be a couple of feet, but it can be, and that's not tidal. That's not even tidal. So seasonal high is very important from that standpoint. And that's where a lot of basements are, I see a lot of problems with basements. Groundwater is a big one. Because once you do find the water, you know, you can always go back and waterproof, but now you got to have all this water to get rid of. The city, for instance, in New York, they're only going to let you have so much capacity to pump in, you know, to pump down the street or pump into the sewer and so forth. So you can really be stuck. Some other things that happen from a geotech due diligence investigation to help you avoid some of these pitfalls are supplemental investigations. A lot of times, here's the other thing too that happens, a lot of times the geotech reports are done in the very beginning of the project, due diligence, that we've been talking about here today. In the meantime, the design changes 3 or 4 times, and the concept is different, and the owner just takes that old report and puts it out there, and everyone goes to bid on it, and there can be real issues with that, because You didn't have a basement, and when we did the investigation, now there's a basement. Or you moved to a part of the site where rock was shallow, or there's a lot of existing fill that's contaminated. So keeping geotech engineers involved in the bidding process, in the specifications, looking at the earthwork specification, things like that's important. Also trying to identify what I call geotechnical premium costs. Everybody knows to a larger extent what it takes to install foundations or create or build conventional shallow foundations. But what if you need to do ground improvement? That's something out of the ordinary, out of the box. That's something we help define. Same with pre-bid and staying in touch with the team. And then CPT&I to me is more, it's construction phase, testing and inspections, and that really goes back to that model that we talked about. And if you look at some of the guidance documents from the American Society of Foundation Engineers, they'll tell you that geotechnical engineers recommendations aren't complete until they see it during construction. Owners don't. No owner is going to agree with that, but it's important to keep the geotechnical engineer involved throughout construction, just so that if things are different, you can make changes real time and keep things moving. Really, at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. All right. So another slide that the leaning tower piece of because we didn't do our geotech investigation. And that brings us to the end. So hopefully you got a little bit out of it. I've got a question here.
Can we talk a little bit about the development, the developer prepared pad?
Yeah.
And I haven't seen that frequently. Where does that?
Yeah,
typically
where I'll typically see that is, where I'll see that from a retail client that has they have a building and it's usually in a shopping center or something like that. And it's an out parcel to that, and they want to just come in and just build their building. Everything else has been there, and those out parcels are usually some of the last portions of the development. If the developer needed good soil, they might have dug a borrow pit in that pad, and because that was an afterthought. And then the retail clients come in, they want the pad. It looks nice because they put a nice foot of sand and they compacted that foot of sand, and then the minute we stick a bucket in the ground, we find out what a disaster it is a lot of times. So if there is a developer prepared pad, that should be, and look, I'm not saying all developers do things crazy. I just, I see when my phone rings when things go wrong a lot, so I see that aspect of it, and this was a little bit of some of the pitfalls that I wanted to try and express to everybody today. And so a lot of times there should be records of compaction records of if the pad is prepared out of fill, there should be compaction records and lift the whole way up. It should be certified by an engineer. If you don't have those things, a lot of times on developer prepared pads, for instance, you want to do test pits in addition to just borings because you want to see a larger cross section. Hopefully that gave a little more insight to it. Here we go.
In historic districts that sometimes they want to excavate sinkholes below, how deep you go? I mean,
Below, well.
You know what I mean? There's any limit or?
Well, yeah. It becomes an economical question. It becomes a limit of what is developed around you, right? As well. So sometimes you're saying if there's bad soils.
I'm saying there are construction or things below because it's an historic site.
Yeah, I think what you're saying. So why would we? Well, generally, if there's poor material there, and you can't remove it, then a lot of times what you do is you try to file through it, and you end up with some type of piles or something like that. Maybe they're drilled piles because you want to keep the disturbance down when you're in a historic district and so forth. And a lot of that goes into it, especially here, the vibration monitoring and things like that. I mean, we were doing vibration monitoring on the Dime Savings Bank forever, because of those very issues.
I noticed that you have those indoor blinds.
Yeah.
Machinery. What if it's just like scaffolding? Is there machinery for borings when there's just outdoor scaffolding, but you needed to get boring on the sidewalk.
Yeah, I mean, those rigs are pretty heavy, so, I mean, we could get under scaffolding, if we could be on the sidewalk, or you're saying actually sit the rig on the scaffolding?
Underneath this.
Yeah, you can do it. The least amount of headroom that we can do is about 7.5 feet. It's just very slow. Well, it's very slow if you need to drill deep because you're adding rods in sections, and if you can only add 3 feet at a time, you're always taking time breaking rods because the way it's done is, I should have had something up here for you, but you basically say you drill down to 5 feet, then you'll put a rod in the ground and push for a sample. You'll pull all that rod out, you get the sample, and you just keep repeating that going down. So if you're breaking rod every 3 feet, it can be, it can take a lot of time. But if you've got 10, 20 feet of rod, it goes a lot quicker. And with that, I think we're there. So thanks everybody for.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.